Professor Terzi, what is the economic context that led Americans to vote for Trump?
Well, that's interesting, but perhaps I should also say my first reaction.
Sure.
I'm on Twitter, and my first tweet was, I'm more curious than frightened. The outcome was, of course, unexpected and unconventional. Unexpected for the reason that we know, all except one did not expect this outcome. But also to put things in context, the outcome was decided by, someone did some calculation, 100,000 votes. That's less than 0.1% on the ballots. So it's more a defeat of Clinton than a Trump's win, which doesn't necessarily give Trump a strong mandate, although, of course, we know Congress and the Senate are Republicans, but he also been fighting with his own party. But probably the scars of the Republican Party will be healed quickly. When you win, it's easy. But that's part of the possible repercussions that we may discuss further. The economic context, I think, is I think it goes back to the 1990s and to the strong economic growth in the 90s that was celebrated. The Clinton growth, the Clinton prosperity, the Clinton budget surplus. That was, in fact, a very risky kind of growth process that was largely based, as we know, on private debt, where the income distribution became increasingly uneven. So the GDP growth figures did not really correspond to a wide prosperity in the country, and in fact caused a very high fragility, which was also caused by the deregulation of the banking sector that was decided by President Clinton. The crisis, of course, will mark the end of this process. But I think the other part of the economic context is the response to the crisis. And I would probably focus largely on the monetary policy that has been used and the quantitative easing. That this policy that by which the U.S. Fed has allegedly injected billions or trillions of dollars into the banking system, and these dollars have not ended in anybody's pocket. It couldn't even be possible for the central bank to inject money into people's pockets. But this did not resolve the crisis in a strong way. This has been the slowest recovery since World War II, and still moderate growth, and the outcome reveals that there is a lot of frustration. There is a very uneven income distribution. Growth has been narrowed to certain sectors of the economy and not being widely spread. And this, I think, explains the anger, the protest, and let me just add that the Americans have been willing for a change of this since 2008. We all recall that in 2008, a relatively unknown Afro-American candidate won the election against all odds, where the most expected president at the time was who? Hillary Clinton, who was not voted because she represented continuation of the old policies. And so the same thing has happened this year with Sanders on one hand and Trump on the other. This, I think, is the context.
Also, Barone Adesi, was it vote against globalization?
Well, certainly against the effects of globalization. And basically what happened with globalization is that the capital was deployed more effectively overseas, and United States found that there were bigger awards for the financial sector, but the middle class was actually squeezed, especially the lower middle class, exposed to competition from overseas workers. And when the private debt caused the collapse of the real estate economy, the answer of the Federal Reserve was quantitative easing, which essentially led to an asset bubble, first and foremost in government bonds, but also real estate in places like New York, very uneven. And so many Americans got tired of hearing for 30 years the country is doing well. However, they were doing slightly worse every year. So it was a protest vote, mostly against Hillary Clinton, and whites ran in good numbers for the Republicans. Young blacks simply stayed home, mostly in Philadelphia and Milwaukee. If they'd voted, they probably would have had the opposite outcome. I think you could have tipped this election by shifting 30,000 votes from Democrats to Republicans in Pennsylvania and New Hampshire. So 30,000 out of 100 million is very small. So I don't think it's fair to say that America, or the American people, has changed these views. It's probably better to say that we all die and Trump came on top.
Mr. Terzi again, how did you personally read the results?
Well, I think, as I said, my first reading was this is a defeat more than a win, and it's a defeat of a policy that has been labeled the Blair-Clinton neoliberalism, if you want, the conventional or consensus macroeconomic approach that has dominating the policy making in the 90s and in 2000s. When I compare the policy proposals of Hillary Clinton on the one hand and Trump on the other, if I take the policy proposal at face value and I discount a number of other corollaries about the character of the person and other things, the Trump proposals, well, they're quite confused and not really, pretty much straightforward, and we'll need to see what he will do with that. But they leave open some possibilities of fiscal expansions, for example. Fiscal expansion has been one of the policies that has been completely neglected since the 1990s, and we've seen Europe running austerity and the United States running what they call sequestration, which is the American equivalent of austerity in Europe. So that, I think, is, if I need to, if we look for silver linings, and we'd like to see some positive thing in the outcome, is perhaps this is the end of this policy, but of course there are a number of conditions that must be materialized before we can really say that this is the case. A greater concern for managing the budget well, using fiscal sustainability in the right way, in the way in which Adam Smith looked at the economy. The economy, the wealth of a nation for Adam Smith is defined by the amount of output that people can use and consume for their conveniences, including what we can produce and what we can buy abroad.
Come back to Professor Mottale. Who is the real Trump?
You can ask him. You may want to look up actually his acceptance speech. It's very interesting because it's quite different from his persona, the one actually that was conveyed to the public by the mass media. And I thought it was quite interesting, which gave us a clue to what he had in mind in terms of more cooperation with the opposition. The other element that stands out is that I was just looking up recently at some of his proposals, and actually they seem quite interesting. They are not in many ways anything revolutionary, paradoxical, or anything that's out of, say, broad standard economic theory. Depends on who his advisors are. But this is interesting. I think the audience is interested more in knowing about foreign policy, for example. Many people thought that he was anti-Mexican or anti-European, anti-NATO, or whatever, anti-Islam, so forth and so on. In many ways, he has articulated ideas that have been around for a long time. As far as I can remember, way back in the time of William Fulbright, some of you may even know who he was. Plenty of people were criticizing NATO expenditures on the part of the United States. The issue of the war with Mexico is not new. It's been around for a long time. The question of closing some gaps here and there. So I knew exactly what he was talking about. As for renegotiating NAFTA, and that's the article on Sidelsky points it out today, by Sidelsky, that way back in the 1990s, remember a character by the name of Ross Perot? Some of you may remember him. The guy was responsible for the victory of Mr. Clinton, actually. He was against NAFTA at the time. There were a lot of people at the time of the signature of NAFTA's cooperation with Mexico who were against it. And in fact, the criticism at the time was that it would drain jobs away from the United States. As it was pushed by Mr. Clinton, sometime above the objections of the unions, and then it happened. By the way, in many ways also created problems for Mexico because their agricultural sector was hurt by American imports, and so the food subsidies were dropped in Mexico, so a lot of poor Mexicans were forced to emigrate to the United States. The NAFTA agreement was touted by Clinton and even earlier by Bush Sr. as a way to stop legal and illegal immigration from Mexico because it would have created more jobs in Mexico. As a matter of fact, it didn't do what it was supposed to do. So the objections to NAFTA are not new. NAFTA originally was an agreement with Canada. It worked with Canada because of reasons that even Professor, my colleague here, could tell you more about it, but Canada is an advanced economy. It has no problems when it comes to the common market in the United States. It was different with Mexico because the economy there is not, in terms of, for example, per capita output at the level of its northern neighbors. So inevitably it created a problem. So it is not that Trump articulated ideas that were new or said something phenomenally insulting. It's the way he conveyed the information. Had he said, for example, that perhaps building a wall would have eased many problems in the United States, would have gone well. But when he's called about the danger of rapists and gangs and dopers and whatnot, that actually irritated a lot of people. But he did so because he knew exactly he was going to get an audience for him. And in that, he was a master at manipulating the same media that actually made fun of him. I'm reminded of Neil Farage, okay? The last speech he gave at the European Parliament was, you laughed at me. As he
Now
said.
let's see who's laughing.
Exactly, let's see who is laughing now. So, in many ways, there's nothing quote new about Trump. As for populism, that's a term that's so vague sometimes that it shows more the bias of one group as opposed to the other. If you don't like somebody, you call him a populist. But let me remind you that in many ways, when Barack Obama ran in 2008, he was, yes, we can. It had a populist appeal. So did Clinton way back in 1992. So populism is embedded in any element of mass politics. You just can't avoid it. It's there. So to think that he was somebody new in terms of the policies that he was articulating, that's not a very valid statement. It stands out, however, that the way he conveyed his ideas are the ones that stood out, and people always remember that rather than the substance of what he was proposing.
Professor Mottale, what about Russia? I mean, with Hillary Clinton, Putin would have been an enemy. Now, is Putin a friend?
Putin himself said the other day that it's not a question of personality, but rather a question of policies. Would President Clinton, Lady Clinton, have had a different policy vis-a-vis Russia? Some people suspected that she had it in for Putin. No, but it's just pure speculation. As for Trump, he has articulated the ideas of many Europeans who have also, and North Americans who have thought that the policy of sanctioning Russia has not been particularly helpful. To what extent has Russia become more cooperative? It has not. Have they left the Ukraine? No. Has it helped resolving the problems of the Middle East? No. By the way, I may add, parenthetically, there are also elements to the state of cooperation between Moscow and Washington people forget. For example, fighting against the drug trade, or for example, the cooperation in the space program. So it's not all negative, but the focus has been the mass media, terrible Putin. Putin very simply said, we'll cooperate with any leader who's willing to change some of their policies. And Trump articulated the idea of, as I said, many American specialists who have thought, for example, Stephen Cohen, it's not a good idea to confront the Soviet Union. I may add, by the way, let me finish, give me a minute, that years ago, at the end of, in the 90s, George Kennan, who formulated the policies of containment, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, because he died a few years ago, he said very clearly you should not be anti-Russian. They have legitimate fears and needs. They're not the Soviet Union anymore. And it's not a question of confronting them with policies that go back to the Cold War. So the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe was perceived by the Russians as something negative. On top of that, the constant anti-Russian propaganda from human rights to minority repression did not suddenly endear the United States and nor Western Europe to Moscow. Now we may very well come up with a reset. We'll have to see.
What about the Russian capital, which saved Trump from bankruptcy?
Well, that's I've seen mentions of it, but to what extent, we have the details. I haven't seen it. It's rumors, lots of rumors. For example, there was a rumor about Russia intervening in the American elections. Some of you saw the reference. Did you see the interview with Medvedev? He just sort of laughed and he said, well, America is not a banana republic, And he knew what he was saying. Very simply, will take time before we figure out what was going on. By the way, let me say something about what the US did to Russia. In the 90s, good old Clinton managed to send his specialists to help Yeltsin. He always said, Yeltsin is my good friend. We know now, and Mel, please correct me if I'm wrong, that had they had a regular, normal election, European style, the communists would have won again. And the US sabotaged the democratic choice of the Russian people. That's often been forgotten. In fact, it was a Russian friend of mine who pointed out to me that, listen, the US intervened deeply in Russian affairs. People have forgotten that. This is after me. And after that, Mr. Clinton promised, assured Yeltsin that NATO would never move out east. NATO was intervening in Georgia. Now, Kennan brought up the point that the Russians, being also mindful of their own history, don't like that.
May I ask each member of the panel the political repercussions on Europe, Professor Adesi?
Well, I think Trump is essentially an opportunist, and he has several opportunities which he may exploit. As Professor Mottale was saying, there is really not much of a bone of contention with Russia. So it's possible to find some agreement with Putin, and Western Europe would certainly benefit from that. NATO, of course, Trump thinks that the Europeans should spend more for their own defense. That is not popular with Europeans. But on the other side, also Trump does not believe in European institutions. He likes to talk to Theresa May, to Angela Merkel, perhaps to François Hollande, but Juncker got very upset because he asked for an urgent meeting and never received an answer. And that, I think, tells us something. But anyway, the real problem that I think Trump will face is the fight between his more ardent supporters and moderate Republicans. If he can manage that, he can enjoy a honeymoon because there is a common base of things he can do. They both agree that the United States should be less involved in world affairs. They also don't like Obamacare. So those are easy for the current majority things to be compact on. Later there will be some serious problems which concern the fiscal policy, because the traditional Republicans don't like deficit spending. And a very thorny problem will be in Asia with the Chinese. So there Trump needs lots of luck, because his allies fear the Chinese, and they're considering to rearm, and also they want America to support them. And the Chinese, of course, are not pleased with that. And the idea of harming the trade with the Chinese is something that deeply worries the Chinese, who built their prosperity on it. But of course, they also have the means to punish the United States if they take that road. So I think that the real problem, the real test of Trump's ability is going to be his relationship with China. And I'm not really happy with the rumor that's going around tonight that Giuliani will be the head of the American diplomacy. I have lots of respect for him, but as a diplomat, I think he's not really.
Professor Terzi, do you agree?
I think one other potential positive effect on Europe might be that if the US, if Europe loses the umbrella protection of the US, Europe may become an adult. Even the idea that the proposal of cutting military spending to defend Europe. Well, maybe it's not a bad idea to have a European military force. So that might play positively in that sense. In the geopolitics of the world economy right now, the biggest threat is the Eurozone. The Eurozone has been initiated in the late 90s with two different interpretations. One was, well, Europe could share the same currency and live with that for a long time. The other interpretation was, this is the first step to greater integration. Now, we found, some people knew this from the start, but we found that currency union hardly lives long without integration. And this is these are the kind of steps that Europe has been making slowly, making some important progress during the crisis, but still far from the formation of an economic and political governance that can in fact bring Europe to prosperity. Europe has huge resources in terms of technology, skills, well, labor force unutilized right now, millions of unemployed, and we need a better economic and political governance for the Eurozone. Perhaps the fact that Europe feels alone without a U.S. protection and umbrella may be a possible incentive for Europe to go forward.
Including on the military side.
Including possibly on the military side. That would be a big step towards, of course, integration, and, political and economic integration.
Thank you very much. I think we can start with questions from the audience. Please.
Don't have microphone, you can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, I was one of the opinions that guessed the result many months ago. And when I started to on the social networks, I started to tell people that Trump would be the winner. Most of the people attacked me on the socials, saying, what are you talking about? You are on the wrong side. I simply try to explain, and I think I have some questions for you, that simply you have to listen what people see and what people want. And I think, and I want to have your opinion, is that the government became like a lobby in Europe, like in Italy also, and the United States, and went far from people. So usually we use the word populistic, but we forgot to think about what people think. And I think that there are some mistakes, and my question is, if you think that it was a mistake, that the President of the United States, Obama, and the First Lady entered into the propaganda or the election process, not like in an institutional way, but personally attacking Trump candidate. And also when Clinton tried to attack Trump on personal stuff, but she has some problems too. And all these matters together, and the role of the United States like a policeman of the world, are factors that really influenced the people that are not decided what to do. I mean, when I was listening, my friends...
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you. Mr. Mottale?
Well, your point about the sitting presidents getting involved in the electoral competition is relevant because it's not common practice to do that. So they may have turned a few people off. As for your own experience about forecasting a Trump victory and people criticizing you, I hope it was not because you sounded like a Trump supporter, because the politically correct view was Trump was crazy and anybody supporting him was crazy. He won because he was politically correct, and Americans are fed up with what is politically correct. The same, by the way, was true for Europeans, and I think soon we see the influence here in Europe for good or bad. You know, obviously Trump knew what he was doing when he articulated those ideas, one of which was, and by the way, let me add, was personal attacks on him. Once that started, then he realized that he could do the same thing and get away with it, and he did. By the way, I may add that the question of personality, Hillary Clinton was not particularly simpatica. Beside all the scandals that went with it, didn't help. By the way, let me add, there were other candidates, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, but they didn't seem to have much consequence for the electoral outcome. We tend to forget that.
Professor Barone, what do you think about it?
Yes, I think that it was a real problem. Basically, your question was why?
The role of the Obama when entering into the campaign and the governmental lobby that came far from people needs and also the personal attacks.
Yes, well, Obama entering into the fray is not as strange as it may appear in Europe, because in America the president is also the head of the government. As if in Italy, if you're familiar with it, we rolled Mattarella and Renzi into one. So of course, as head of the government, he has his views, he has his party, is not above. It is true that once they're elected, they're supposed to try to unify the country, but that works up to a point. Basically, they have a spoil system, and we don't takes it all. The fact that this federal bureaucracy had moved far away from the sensitivities of people has to do a lot with the incestuous relationship it has with the media. Newsmen like to be nice to the government to get some news firsthand, and of course the government listens to the news media to hear what the people think. So after a while we persuaded ourselves that it was totally unthinkable that Trump could be competing seriously. But unfortunately the people were acting differently. And that also gave a lot of space to social media, which are harder to control. So actually there were lots of criticism of Facebook, for example, because some commentators said that Facebook helped Trump. Facebook is like a microphone. Of course, you cannot control it the way you control 100 daily newspapers.
Okay, Professor Terzi, just a few words.
Are we all answering each question?
No, but that's if you want to add something, okay. So we can go on to the next person.
Perché sembra che parli meglio senza microfono. I want to know something about the intention or project of Trump about the Middle East context, the Middle East challenge, because I heard that in Israel they are very happy of the election of Trump, and I'm happy. Me too, for this. But which is the intention about the Middle East challenge context?
You know, Trump came to power in 2008 by extending a hand to the Middle East, including Iran. Didn't work out to the extent the United States is mired in a lot of problems. For whatever reason, we need not go into all the details. As for the reception of Trump's election in the Middle East, my friends amongst the Arab government officials tell me that publicly many have denounced Trump, but in private they denounced the Obama administration for its failures in the Middle East and not living up to the expectations that he had elicited in the area. The idea of cooperating with Russia is an example of an attempt to resolve some of the problems with Moscow and possibly even other members of the Security Council. And I personally have always written about it, saying the only way you can have some modicum of peace is having great power cooperation, because that has been the case historically. It's the idea, remember after the Arab Spring, democracy is coming. You must be kidding, you know. And by the way, Obama and his administration were blamed for many of the disasters in countries such as Libya, Egypt, where the governments there lost the real or imaginary support of the United States. Remember what happened to poor Mubarak a few months earlier, you know, he had been meeting Obama, and they did fine together. Once the demonstration started, the U.S. managed to undermine to the extent the Saudis turned against the United States. Sometime later, Obama had to go to Saudi Arabia to reassure them as he was making deals with Iran and scare the hell out of the Saudis, and then proceeded to arm every crazy group in the Middle East they could get away with against the Shias. So if the American policy was to bring some degree of stability, the policies of the State Department and Obama himself are not very particularly helpful. We'll see what happens in the future. It's hard to say. My own view is the Middle East is pretty much hopeless and helpless, so stay away from it, you'll be better off.
Question?
So, as we've seen from some of the exit polls, the electorate that chose Donald Trump is relatively more educated than expected, whereas the narrative throughout the election thus far has been that those who support Trump are uneducated, working class, white people. How then does this change that narrative? I mean, even tonight we've already discussed the former understanding that those were the people that were propelling Trump to victory. It appears to have been a lack of participation for those who would normally support Hillary Clinton, rather than some kind of mandate for Trump from new individuals. How does that change our understanding of this election?
Yeah, according to the first pundits, sounds like most Americans are white, old, uneducated, and use Facebook. Clearly, that is not the demographics of the United States. So, it is true that young blacks in 2 or 3 very important urban areas stayed home and by not voting tipped the election result. But certainly there was a deep frustration in the middle class for things like Obamacare. Essentially, Obamacare doubled healthcare premiums for some of these families. And you know, if your salary is slightly behind where it was 30 years ago, and then as great a reform that doubled your healthcare premium, you are not pleased. Certainly Obama lost lots of his political capital with Obamacare. He had to fight very hard to get it, and the results came out short of his expectations. But of course that had to wait at the election time. And also his economic policy, really, he's not an economist. So he delegated a lot of his economic policy and a lot of his foreign policy to the old lobby of the Clintons, the New York lobby. And they made a mess in both areas, at least as far as the middle class is concerned. So they were not very happy.
That's strange because usually the Obamacare is very popular in Europe.
Yes, because we cannot conceive a society without universal medical care. Of course, I'm Canadian, so I'm more European than Europeans on that particular aspect. But Obamacare is my impression that it is a bit like the Swiss system without government subsidies for low-income people. The idea is that the middle class has to pay for the care of the people more disadvantaged. And that is something very hard to swallow for the middle class if their economic conditions have not improved for 30 years.
Okay, do
Again,
you want to
no,
add something?
No, again, the Obamacare is certainly not perfect, but one problem is the weak economy again. Right?
Yeah, that's probably
Yes,
problem.
exactly. The weak economy. The macro numbers seems good today, but those numbers are hiding a number of things, including, for example, the reduction in the participation rate in the labor force, which is an important factor that has not picked up again after the crisis. And there are a number of signals that the economy is not really that strong. And that's also one of the reasons why the Fed has been hesitating to raise interest rates. So far, they will definitely raise interest rates in December, I believe. So, but again, the economic policy dimension is an important element. We can see the American voters in this election being sick and tired of hitting all these $1 trillion spent with banks domestically or spent in military operations in areas of the world that these voters cannot even locate on the map, and experience a very low standard of living home. That's the discrepancy that explains this process.
So that's a root of it all, right? That's a root. Okay? Any other question? Sure.
So, I was wondering if you could briefly touch upon the role that gender played in this election, because one, you have Hillary Clinton as the first nominee of a major political party to be a woman. You had others in the past, but I mean, one, that's significant. Two, you have the double standard that you have in women and men, and I think that has been very evident in this election in terms of the level of acceptability. You know, there's been a lot of discussion as to what Trump has done and some of the things he's gotten away with. If it was a woman, there's no way she would have gotten there, and vice versa. And I was wondering if you could touch a little bit upon how gender relations have gone into that, especially because the level of allowability and double standards plays into it. I know, for instance, that a number of people said that regardless of Hillary's policies or anything else, they could never vote for her because they could never imagine a president being a woman, not a man.
Okay, so gender. Who wants to answer?
Listen, the majority of working class women, and I'm waiting for the latest statistic come out, voted for Trump. Obviously, the fact that there was a female candidate per se was not going to be the primary concern of people who have to go and pay taxes and work. The concern about gender is an upper class American phenomenon of which, of course, we are very much aware of. The fact is that at the very end, people voted their own interests, psychocultural and economic. So this idea of gender was very, very important, misled those who thought that by definition, you know, she should win. So it's no use to go around this claim has to do with misogyny. Americans are not in general misogynists, the women are not, very simply. They voted for a candidate they thought that best represented their interests. No use to sit down and speculate about what role gender played. At the end of the day, political science look at political behavior. How did they vote? They voted for the other candidate.
Any other?
What about of Kim Jong-un now? Donald Trump wants to make friends with him.
Sorry,
Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea.
He wants to make what?
Oh, friendship.
North Korea.
That's a tough one, but if we succeed, we'll be happy.
Well, you know, the Korean leadership is not perceived as being particularly rational. And basically, the Trump solution, which by the way comes from a few American generals, said, well, let's arm South Korea and Japan and see what happens to the North Koreans. And suddenly the North Koreans started getting a little queasy about it. So did the Chinese. And the Chinese now are putting pressures on North Korea, so it worked. We'll see what happens. You don't have friends in international relations. Okay? You can't be friends. It's an American obsession of nice liberals. Friends. Okay, other question?
I'm Australian, and I'm a visitor to this beautiful country, and I'm very interested to hear what you gentlemen have to say. It doesn't really matter what character Mr. Trump is, or why he has been sometimes a bit outrageous in the last few weeks. Somebody told me that money is not everything, but without money, everything is nothing. But you gentlemen have not talked about money tonight. My questions. Number one, would you imagine that in the next 2 years the inflation rate picks up? In fact, it has started. And number two,
Professor Terzi wrote a book on money.
number two, could you imagine that the interest rate internationally goes 6 to 4%? And number three, what would that mean for the budget of the United States and for the budget of Japan and in particular for the budget of China?
Well, this is a big one. It's a tough one, but let me begin by saying that one of the concerns about Trump's understanding and approach to economic problems and issues is the big confusion he has been doing about some fundamental concepts during the campaign, including this fixation for the problem of the United States being indebted to China. Now, it seems to confuse the situation of a country like, say, Nigeria that needs dollars, and therefore they borrow dollars from a private bank or from the IMF, and then they will have to come up with dollars that they must earn somehow to return the loan. China is not in this, I mean, the US is not in this situation. The Chinese have their own dollars that they obtain by selling merchandise to the US, and they simply switch from the dollars to treasury securities because these treasury securities give an interest rate. This is not a debt that should preoccupy the American people. But of course there is you just need to navigate on the web to see how much terrorism on this issue has been done. So his idea of slashing the trade deficit, because this creates the he has been discussing the possibility even not to default on the debt to China, which of course is possible, but it's not certainly financially necessary, because the United States will always have the dollars to pay back the debt. So more specifically on the possible forecast that we can make at this time on the things that you brought up, it very much will depend on what kind of economic policy Trump will be able to implement. Everybody in these days looks at two possible scenarios. A Trump 1 is the Trump which continues the outrageous behavior of the campaign. Trump 2 is a Trump that worked together with the rest of the political spectrum and hopefully even not only the Republican Party but possibly also Democrats. He has on the plate an important tax cut, which if he does it, the tax cut is not only on the highest rich people, it's pretty much across the board. And has a tax cut which will be expansionary on the economy. He has an infrastructure plan, but there are a number of reasons to be a little hesitant to think that this will easily be implemented. One, the infrastructure spending is devised in a public-private partnership, which is not clear how this will work out. Something similar has been tried by Juncker in Europe and hasn't worked so far at all. The tax cut will surely be helpful to the middle class, but currently Congress has very strict rules on the budget. And these rules can only be changed with a large majority, larger than the Republicans have. So that's why it would need a larger alliance to change those rules. You also asked about interest rates. Interest rates are very much, we live in market economies, and market economies are monetary economies, and money is something that is issued monopolistically by the state that gives this power to an agency called the central bank. So the economy is never free of being managed, it's always managed one way or the other. The interest rates are managed by central banks, largely. In fact, central banks have a strong power to bring interest rates to any level. In Europe, they brought it to negative. In Sweden, in 1992, they brought it to 500%. They can do whatever they wish. So, if a fiscal expansion materializes, which I'm not so sure because of those constraints, in the United States, and growth picks up, and the economy improves, this might be a reason for interest rates to go up somewhat, maybe inflation to pick up a little. That's a possibility. But as I see it now, it will not be an easy road to go through for those reasons.
Is it okay for you, sir?
Well, how many percent, in your opinion, professors, of the budget will have to go to interest if the interest rate goes to 4%? The budget of the United States.
If interest rate goes up to 4%, well, then what happens to the budget? There will be more payments on interest.
How much? 10%.
No, very little initially. It grows over time because you have long-term bonds the bonds which are already out do not change their coupons. Once you have to refinance them, of course, you go up.
But we're getting out of bonds.
Hey,
Nobody touches them with a 10-foot pole with any sense.
oh, the Federal Reserve is buying them, don't worry. The Chinese.
Are you, but are you concerned about the sustainability of the budget, or?
Yes.
The US budget is always financially sustainable. The United States print the currency. They're not borrowing a foreign currency. So it's always financially sustainable. The problem of a good fiscal policy is not to balance the budget at all times, for all reasons, but rather to follow the prescriptions of Adam Smith. The main goal of policy is to maximize the output that people can consume for their conveniences, including also things that you can buy from abroad. Normally you buy from abroad by exporting something. The United States is lucky enough that foreigners are so eager to hold dollars that they just sell merchandise to the United States. But that's a luck.
You know,
It's
the
not a problem.
The Spanish were saying the same thing in the 16th century. You see where Spain today.
That was a gold standard. That's different.
The Chinese buy with the American dollars. Companies in Europe and millions of acres of land in Australia. Mark my word.
Last question?
Yeah, before we wrap up and then we continue upstairs. So who was okay, the lady there, sorry. Yeah, to this.
I would like to know how binding agreements by previous presidents are to the president-elect, because he threatened to go back on the agreements that were finally made about climate control. What is the reality of that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mel, but the Senate did not ratify the climate control treaty. So it's not valid under American law. So in theory, as long as the Senate doesn't ratify it, Trump doesn't have to do anything.
So you mean that they're the only nation who decide to wash their hands of the responsibility?
Well, there are other countries that may change their minds too. Let me remind you that there was some sort of like a Kyoto agreement years ago, and eventually nobody abided by it. But Canada first ratified, and they said we're going to stop abiding by it. So we tend to take too seriously some of these things because of our personal concerns. As it is, the United States domestically is committed to a serious policy about, controlling pollution on the local level. If you're concerned about it, you should ask the Indian, it's up to America now. You should ask governments that ratify it, and then they'll never do anything about it. By the way, should it be ratified by the Senate, it's binding on a new president.
Okay, let me just sum up. With the Trump presidency, America has turned a new page in its history. We still have to see if he will be a good president, so as to be entitled to deserve a second mandate. In the meanwhile, I think the time has come for America to afford what Martin Luther King called the luxury of cooling off. We all look forward to it. Thank you all for being with us.